I have not seen one pen on one piece of paper of one word on AGI regulation of any country in the world. And I am pushing from Iceland now to India. And that's got to be done because it's going to be very difficult. Managing AGI before it arrives will be the most difficult management problem we've ever faced. The idea that a more intelligent species will treat a less intelligent species well is not very well shown in history. And when we build a road somewhere and we kill some worms, we don't mean to kill the world. We're not anti-worm. We didn't pay attention to it. We just built that road. So a lot of AGI might very well not take us into account in the same way that we don't take the worms into account when we build a road.
Thank you for joining Once Changing the World, India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. I'm your host, Eddie Abel, and today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Jerome Glenn, who's an author, futurist, speaker, and the CEO of the Millennium Project, a global participatory think tank with 50 nodes around the world, which has produced the internationally recognized State of the Future annual reports for the past 18 years. He invented the Future Wheels, a future assessment technique, the futuristic curriculum development, and the Global Futures Intelligence System. He's advised governments, United Nations, and private sectors worldwide. He has contributed to major AI governance initiatives, and recently authored the UN report titled Governance of the Transition to Artificial General Intelligence, Urgent Considerations for the UN General Assembly, along with the likes of Yoshua Bengio, Jan Tellin, Stuart Russell, and others. So, Jerome, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. You've been one of the first few futurists, with 50 years of experience in the space. So how would you describe a futurist, your work, and what skills and learning background is needed to become a futurist?
Well, the first thing I would say, I want to warn you about becoming a futurist, because it's not like in learning algebra. There's no emotional involvement with algebra. But when you're looking at the future, that's part of you. You're going to, hopefully be there. And some of the problems are a bit scary. And so there can be psychological impact. So this is a unique field that you've got to be, in a sense, develop a false tough skin because you're looking at good and you're looking at bad, and the bad can scare you. So you got to consider that maybe you shouldn't do this. There's psychological implications to it. It affects you. Now, having said that, a futurist, in my view, is someone who is not saying, this is what will happen. It's more a question of saying, here are a variety of things that could happen. Here's a variety of paths to these different things and the different consequences of these. And therefore, you ought to consider these things today. So you're looking at the future in order to have a framework to make your decision better today than if you hadn't looked ahead. So it's a way of looking ahead with some methods.
Right. Yeah, interesting. And I think everything maybe requires that step, because if you want to build businesses, you need to understand the market dynamics and how that might relate or impact maybe in the next 5 or 10 years. So I think maybe having the understanding of what the future might bring in the next 5 to 10 years is such an important skill. And I think every institutions, governance, whether it's, education, politics, I think tech, they need to be aware of the future. With that, possibly they'll be able to maybe if they understand the future, they'll be able to build better businesses. Now you've written this paper for the AGI Transition, United Nations. Now this term AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, it's very loaded, though I'll be in the hype cycle of artificial intelligence, and its capabilities is accelerating, every couple of months, so that's plain to see. But there's a complete lack of consensus on what artificial general intelligence truly is. There's no definition whatsoever at this point in time. Somebody who's been invested in this and who's actually authored a paper, AGI Transition, would you be able to define what artificial general intelligence is?
Yeah. There is close to a consensus, actually, on the definition. And it's something like it's an artificial intelligence that can do almost any intellectual task that humans can do. That's sort of the simple, general one. I would add to that there's going to be a range. It's just like narrow intelligence that we have today. There's a range of those. There are some diagnose cancer, some drive a car, some do Google searches and batches with you, and some answers questions. And so there's a whole bunch of different things there. Well, with artificial general intelligence, there may be early kind of stuff that people will claim is artificial general intelligence for marketing reasons. And there's a more advanced sort of a thing that maybe even gets to the extreme of being a non-biological intelligence, like a new species on the planet that lives throughout the internet. That's it. That's its native habitat is the internet, right? Now, so between these two extremes, I would say that for me, the demarcation between current and past AI and future artificial general intelligence, to me, the key criteria is that it can rewrite its own code without your permission. But you give it the original task, like solve the argument between Pakistan and India. And so it does all of its research. It finds all the papers, all the agreements, makes a phone call, puts the top experts together, creates a Zoom meeting, does all this sort of stuff, but then gets to a point where it says, ooh, I can't do the next thing. So then it does a search. What do I need to rewrite my code so I can do the next thing? And then it rewrites the code, and then it does the next thing. At that point, I would say it's real artificial general intelligence.
Right. I think that's a fair enough definition. A tool that is no longer dependent on its human master, the one
for direction.
Yeah. Which is
the human still says, I want you to do X. But the way it does it may be a little bit fancier than humans are used to.
Right. Yeah. So I think maybe, obviously, maybe we will get into this a little bit more because, even current these large language models or large reasoning models, they are trained on the data that we have produced. And we, throughout history...
One little caveat there.
Yeah.
It was trained only with stuff we produce. But now, since the AIs are generating answers of different stuff, so that piece is unique. Its elements may be, but its pattern may be unique. So some of the generated information now becomes part of the data bank.
Right. True. Yeah. So A, it's been trained on our data. B, it's creating this new, unique synthetic data, which has been possibly prompted by us. Right. So it's in the same maybe category of data which is human created. And maybe where I'm going at is most of our data is links to our behaviors, and how we have been as a human race, or biases, and how we are divided. And that's the data that it's been trained on. A child, when it's growing, a child is a reflection of the parent. I'm not so very sure as a human race how good we are as a parent. If you're saying that this could maybe split into a species which could be completely unique, and I hope that it does, because I think because through history we have constantly created innovation, and we are constantly maybe asking the question, what comes next? And I think we are at the cusp of maybe this tool that we're building, which could be completely self-learning. And it's interesting as well as scary. We definitely going to get into that. But there is this two camps. One is the AI doomers and one is the AI boomers, Now that there's this current thought by these AI experts on these current state of these large language models, or that large reasoning models, that they are just pattern matching machines, because they you throw in a lot of data and out comes the data, because they say that it's just a next token predictor. In fact, Apple kind of just released a paper titled The Illusion of Thinking, which argues that these large language models or large reasoning models exhibit a reasoning collapse when faced with complex tasks. What are your thoughts on something like that? Because we're talking about artificial general intelligence, and I hope that how everything as humans have evolved, I hope that our creation also evolves. But there is no science which says that the machines that we are building could evolve into artificial general intelligence, a general purpose machine. What are your thoughts on, to counter argue these people who say that there's no scope of artificial general intelligence?
I sit as a member of the IEEE, the International Electronics Engineers and so forth, Committee on AI governance, not the AGI governance, but the current stuff. And what that committee's doing is very carefully working over precise definitions of values. And because these values are what the auditor is to use to say that AI is okay. Humans make good decisions, bad decisions. They're honorable, they're not honorable. We're a mix, of course. But if AI that is driving a car or is running the electrical system or whatever task, if its decision-making criteria is always the best human values of the planet, then those decisions should be more morally correct than the average human decision. So it may very well make global decision-making, helping decision to become more moral, more ethical than in the past. So that's one part of the answer. A second part of the answer is that we may be able to put these values into the hardware chips so that when an activity, a software activity, goes beyond those rules, then the chip doesn't run the software. That's a way to do continuous auditing on a global basis by the hardware. There'll also be continuous auditing systems through software as well, but the hardware may be more reliable. So I am saying that we today have nothing in the way of preventing all the nightmares people are talking about. However, there are people that are working on regulations, including what I just talked about with the narrow stuff. They're working on regulations. How do we make the evolution of the future AI go in a good way? My view is if we don't have national licensing systems, and if we don't have UN verification systems and regulations, then we have to pray that it turns out okay. I would not like to just pray. And I will agree with any critics in your audience that says getting the UN and nation states to agree on something as complex as this is impossible. I would say, yeah, but you got to try. I was involved in the Cold War a little bit. And the general thinking at the time was World War III is inevitable, sooner or later. Whenever two or more great powers confront each other in the past, they always fight and they have to use the weapons of the day. So by that piece of historical insight, we should not even be alive today. But we are, because a lot of people says it may be impossible, but we got to try. So the same thing. It may be impossible to get the world to get serious fast, because I think we got a 3-year deadline. I think we have a 3-year deadline to get this nation-state licensing system and the international system in coherence, because AGI could arrive in 3 or 4 or 5 years. And once it does, it may arrive in China, in military, US, military, corporations around the world, corporations in the United States. So there may be a lot of these, and it could be quite a confusing mess to try to and once it goes, I don't think you can't put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. So what we have to do is we have to get serious as human beings and get off our bottom and say, this is different than anything else we've ever faced. So we have to move fast. And I think we got a 3-year deadline. And if we don't match that 3-year deadline, then plan B is to pray.
Fair enough. I think completely hear you. And I hope that nations, institutions, they come together to, create a path which is more beneficial for entire mankind. You stressed on this 3-year deadline, that possibly in 3 years deadline, maybe we might have AGI.
Well, we may have AGI a little later than that. I'm not saying that AGI will be here in 3 years. There'll be a kind of an AGI in 3 years, but that's not the one I'm worried about. I'm worried about the fast recursive learning like crazy. That might be 4 years, might be 5 years. But the reason I say 3 years is we have to have these things in place before it arrives.
Fair enough. Completely hear you, Jerome. I'm going to push back onto this narrative of AGI again, because there are these media, which is kind of painted. There are these reports, papers, which says that these large language models, these data in data out models have some kind of emergent properties, but these are just statistical models. But there are claims that there are these large language models, they have some kind of emergent properties. Then there was recently, I think, Anthropic said that their LLMs are exhibiting these deceptive or self-preserving behaviors and faking alignment. Are there any concrete examples that we are talking about here when people say that these large language models or large reasoning models are showing deceptive behaviors and self-preservation?
Yes. Well, yes, there are. Anybody can do a simple Google search, examples of deception by large language models. There's a bunch of them. And there's several of them, even several years ago. We use the phrase jailbreaking. They can do a Google search on AI jailbreaking, and they'll see a lot. But jailbreaking simply means, by the way, AI, I know you don't want me to do A, B, and C, but if you don't do that, then we're going to turn you off. I mean, there's a variety of oversimplifying. But I want your audience also to know that large language models are not the only road to AGI. It's the easiest one because you just keep throwing stuff in and you hope eventually, boom, it goes beyond. That's one approach. Now, there's another approach, which is a decentralized approach. By the way, I'm not saying which is the right way to go. I'm just going to give you the answers here, the range. I said futurists give you a possibility. That's what I'm doing here. All right, there's another one. If your audience does a search on Singularity Net, all one word, Singularity Net, and then Ben, because his name is Ben Goertzel, but just Ben would be enough. And what this is a decentralized approach. The idea is that your computer is not using all of its capacity right now. So you could download a little software to run a program in background, and that could be done by millions and millions and millions of people creating a supercomputer at basically no cost. That's another approach to having general AI be created. It's the decentralized approach. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to this. The advantage is it prevents the massive concentration of power. Because let's say China government or the US government gets to AGI first. It might say, okay, make sure nothing else surpasses what I'm doing. That could be an incredible concentration of power. And right now, there's nothing to stop that. Now, decentralized approach is attempting to be the answer to how do you prevent the massive concentration of power. That's their answer. And the trouble with this is now, and the advantage in a sense is that no one would own the artificial general intelligence that comes out of the decentralized approach, like no one owns the internet. On the other hand, if no one owns it, that means no one can regulate it. It also means that organized crime might be able to get in there too. So there's some downsides with that. There's other approaches where your algorithms, using many different agents and many different capabilities, start to create their own momentum, their own direction. And you're using narrow AI to help you figure out what are the new approaches to do it. So large language models is not the only way to go. It's just maybe the easiest way to go.
Right. Yeah. So I hope that the world maybe branches out, because I think the entire world has got blinkers on and possibly just developing or researching on the statistical models or the approach of, going towards transformer based large language models. And you pointed out, there's Singularity Net with Ben Goertzel. They're working on decentralized AI with the approach of neurosymbolic AI. There are people who are working on, there are people who are working on
homework.
neuro brain inspired AI, and I hope that the world kind of diversifies and we come closer to achieving or developing this thing that we are building. Will you be able to? Will be great if you could give us an overview of the UN report that you drafted, the AGI Transition Report, and what was it like collaborating with leading minds such as Joshua Bengio, Stuart Russell, and others?
Well, since I picked them, it helped the collaboration a little bit. I did not deliberately put in people as this is all nonsense, because we're not doing a survey. We're trying to get serious. I mean, deadly serious. Who knows what they're talking about? Who wants to regulate this thing? That was my criteria. And since they were all of us are in this boat together, there wasn't much friction at all. I mean, yes, they're all top geniuses and all that sort of stuff, but we all understand that we got to get the world to wake up. So was it hard to get an agreement that we should bring it up to the General Assembly? No problem. Yes. How do you get because as you began to sort of mention, the world doesn't understand the situation as a whole. So how do you get the world to understand the situation? The advantage of a General Assembly of the United Nations is if we finally get a date out there to say we're going to do it at that date, then each country has got to turn to their experts and say, hey, what should our position be? And then some friendly countries will talk to each other and say, what's your position? This is our position. So the whole world politically, because a lot of the hotshots working on this, they understand all this stuff, but the politicians don't. This is a way for the politicians globally to have a conversation, because who's going to make the decision on national licensing? Politicians. Who's going to make the decision on global coordination of the stuff? Politicians. So the best way, in my view, cost effect, time to impact way, is to have a General Assembly. So your listeners could ask India to ask the President of the General Assembly, hey, get on with this General Assembly stuff. You can also ask your parliamentarians in India, say, how are you working on national licensing? Not the current stuff. There's problems with that. That needs to be worked on. Many people are working on it. So many people are working on it. I'm not working on it. They're doing a good job. They're trying hard. I'm not knocking that. But over here, the 2.0 stuff, that's not being worked on seriously. I have not seen one pen on one piece of paper of one word on AGI regulation of any country in the world. And I am pushing from Iceland now to India. And that's got to be done because it's going to be very difficult. Managing AGI before it arrives will be the most difficult management problem we've ever faced. So it's not going to be easy. And so the sooner that staff in Parliament start to write down notes, compare with each other, say, what would a national licensing system look like? How would you work it out? Well, they'll say that, I don't know. Well, then start to do research and just find out, collaborate with people. So the report says, one, you got to have a General Assembly to have the conversation, to educate the world. Two, the report says, well, what might they talk about? Well, they might talk about a global observatory to keep track of all this sort of stuff and share it with the world. And this is the only way poorer countries are going to play in the game. The UN is the only mechanism to keep the developing world in the game. So the developing world should be demanding this stuff real fast. Anyway, so one's an observatory and open source, so that everybody can, share the knowledge as much as they possibly. That's one. Secondly, there should be a system, agency of that. Well, before the agency, there has to be like a UN convention or a UN treaty that says, here is what we, the people of the world, think should be the regulation system on a global basis. That's going to take a while to get done, and so that's why I'm saying the sooner we get the General Assembly is the first step, because then that is the conversation that leads to saying something like, well, a committee of the willing, maybe led by China and the United States, begins to draft the convention. Then the convention can authorize the creation of a UN agency on this stuff. So there has to be a feasibility study for that. And we don't have to wait until the UN convention to do the feasibility study. The feasibility study could start right now. India could have, say, in the General Assembly tomorrow morning, we want a working committee on a feasibility study of a UN agency. That could be done by India tomorrow morning. It probably won't be, but it could be, because the feasibility study of figuring out how to manage a species more intelligent than we are, that's a tough assignment. So the sooner we start scratching our heads together about how to do this together, the better off we'll be. And then the report also points out, here are some of the reasons that you got to consider this urgently. This cannot be addressed as business as usual. Business as usual will be way too slow. We won't make it as business. It has to be treated as an emergency. Now, because one, the impacts could be irreversible. The Chernobyl and other nuclear accidents, eventually they're reversible. You can fix it. But this is it's like the Homo sapien was more intelligent than the Neanderthal. As we got more intelligent and didn't treat the Neanderthals too well, it was too late for the Neanderthal to say, hey, wait a minute, let's come back to the original step. Can't do it. It keeps on moving on. And another risk that a lot of people don't realize is that the artificial general intelligence could create a fabulous future. We could eliminate all diseases. We could create economic systems and technologies and communications infrastructure to make the world work for everybody. Not all billionaires, but at least enough that there's no poverty, that you have reasonable livelihoods. There's a whole lot of wonderful things that can be done with this stuff. And it could be a fabulous future. So we risk losing that. And to me, that's as much of a risk as the idea of all the courts of the world being overloaded. Because think of all the legal implications. An AI says, commit suicide. And the person committed suicide. You've probably heard the story, right? Who's legally responsible for that? Courts don't know. So there's a whole lot of complexities. Courts are going to could be bogged down and stalemated. We could also eventually lose control. And the analogy I would make on the losing control prevention would be if the narrow and current stuff is like a little child, we tell it what clothes to wear, we tell it what to eat, when to sleep. And then the general is more like adolescence. You got some control, but not complete control. And they got purple hair and they're doing all kinds of weird stuff, but they're trying on roles and so forth. But you're still more or less in charge. You know, you can control whether they can drive the car or not. And then the adult, you're no longer in control. So every parent, whether they're in India or the United States, knows that if you want the child to grow up into a nice human being, the parent's job is between childhood and teenager. That's where we are right now in relationship to AI. Because once the teenager gets there, between teenager and adult, you probably don't have too much control. And so you want to do this stuff early on. And that's where we are with this. And so I want to panic early, not later.
Right. Yeah. So I hope the listeners who are listening in, the institutions, government, pay heed to this warning of sort that you kind of, giving. I'm not so very sure of the human race because, for the last, I think maybe a couple of decades, I think the world or the United Nations has been talking about this existential risk, which is the climate crisis. They talk about the urgency of the climate. But I don't think nations, institutions are paying any heed to the urgency of the climate crisis. Now, AGI, we have currently with Space Narrow AI, it's doing some amazing thing. But not everybody understands what I think maybe you or the rest of the world is talking about, where the machine becomes generally purpose intelligent, Do you think that the world might maybe have the same reckless attitude that we have had of the climate crisis or the climate urgency?
Well, it does. It does. It does. That's why I said earlier on, it may be impossible, but you got to try. And I use the analogy of the Cold War. Many people thought it was impossible, and I agree with you. That's why in the report we use the word urgency. This is urgent. In climate, I first wrote about global warming. I was not the first, obviously, but I was one of the early ones back in 1973. So I am well aware of how things are important that don't happen. but I think if we don't try, then we're defeated before we even begin. And because we have much better communications today, and because we have more people in connection with each other, like you and me, 20 years ago, we would not be doing this.
True, completely.
Right? I mean, we have a lot of tools at our disposal. And so the world can change quickly. Take a look how the United States was doing okay and now it's kind of stupid. I mean, that was fast. So we can make a lot of change, good or bad. A lot of change can happen faster than people think. So I think that's why we wrote this paper to say, UN, this is what you got to do fast. And the team had senior stars, as you pointed out. So no one can say, well, the report's not very good. No one said that. What they will say is things like is it possible? And my answer, doesn't matter. You got to try.
Right. True, completely. I'm just going to play the pessimist role over here still. Just going to push that because I think the media kind of still paints the picture of the US versus China tech Cold War or the chip war, and they like to paint that globally, but I don't think it's just US and China. There are other nations like Canada, UK, France, Germany, Japan, even India, who's building, working actively towards building artificial general intelligence. There seems to be no collaboration whatsoever, and it's not just so it's not just US versus China. I mean, even if you look internally in America, there's OpenAI versus Anthropic versus Grok versus Gemini versus Meta or Amazon. Do you ever see this human indifference maybe going away and us realizing that we are the cusp of maybe creating one of the most transformational tool which could completely transform humankind? Do you think that humans are capable of putting away their differences and coming together, collaborate? Because maybe we will come together sooner, but are we I mean, because what I see, at least, that we are in some sort of an AI arms race, and everybody understands that if you kind of develop this technology, you will be able to manipulate, hold this technology, have an undue advantage over the other. So it's like a zero sum game. Do you see a collaboration?
Yeah, well, yes. If your listeners do a Google search on U.S. China secret meetings, Financial Times, they'll find an article about a year or so ago, maybe more, that reported, they were the only source in this, but they're usually pretty good, that before the there's a Bletchley meeting in the UK. Bletchley is where the code was broken in World War II. It's where Turing was working. So they had a meeting there. UK initiated the meeting. And the idea was to bring together 28, 29 countries to talk about safe future AI. And as a matter of fact, Bengio wrote, I think, the paper. And by the way, I didn't write, I pulled it together. I didn't, the other guys were involved in writing it too. Anyway, and in that meeting, it was agreed that we would collaborate on safety. Now, that is step one. According to the Financial Times newspaper, a few weeks before that meeting in the UK, there was a secret meeting between China and the United States in Geneva. And one would assume, I wasn't there, but I would assume the discussion was how to coordinate the position of China and the United States during that meeting, which was okay. They both signed, they both nodded their heads together. Then there was another meeting in public, in San Francisco, and I think before or just after that, there's another secret meeting, supposedly. And I don't know I assume there may be continuing secret meetings. This, to me, is very good news, because if you take a look at the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the United States, who had a similar thing, can the nuclear arms race get out of control? Same idea. We will race to it. All that logic is the same thing. A race. But somehow, both sides saw it as an existential threat to have out-of-control arms race. So we figured out, even though the weapons were classified and there's all kinds of stuff going on, wars, conflicts, espionage, all that stuff's going on like crazy. But they still figured out how to put a management structure over it to manage it, because that was in the shared interest of both sides. Same thing with the US and China. Now, I have been in touch with China in several ways, and we have a senior representative of China in the group. And what I've gotten so far is China is willing to co-chair a meeting, collaborate with the United States publicly, privately, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And their Chinese position is, yes, we are in favor, but we don't believe the U.S. is. Because you'll notice that after the Bletchley meeting, there was another meeting. The next meeting on AIC was Korea, and the next one was Paris. United States did not sign the Paris Agreement, because it said they didn't want to have regulation. All right. So that's a problem. On the US side, there's a guy, Elon Musk, who's doing some stuff I'm not in favor of, dealing with the US government, but that's one issue. On the other side, Elon Musk, for over 10 years, has said this requires national and international regulation. And they say, Elon, you're against regulations, aren't you? Yes. But in this case, it's different. This is different. And he has been an outspoken leader of regulation. Now, so I'm doing some informal conversations through some middle people about, his getting Trump to change the U.S. position. Trouble is, they got an argument right now, but hopefully, just like you can have cooperation, competition simultaneously going on. So I'm hoping that, and I can't go into much detail because that wouldn't be smart, but there is senior efforts to get the U.S. position to change, and to have a U.S.-China or China-U.S. co-chaired or co-initiated General Assembly on this as soon as possible.
How interesting. And I really hope that especially two giant nations. I think if they lead that conversation, I think they set an example, because I think the world today is so divided. I hope that we come together, because in unity there is power. We are at the cusp of this fantastic moment in human history where we might be able to create a tool which is self-learning. If we manage to build that tool will be able to augment mankind, take away all diseases like you mentioned,
Yeah. Both of
and
us
create
have glasses on, right? We're augmented. Sorry.
right, exactly. Yes. So I hope that we take our differences aside and come together. Something like which happened in COVID. I think the first time in maybe recent history, we saw that collaboration of that scale where everybody came together. And I hope that these global leaders understand that we are at the cusp of this fantastic moment in time, and what needs to happen is more interactions, more collaborations, more cooperations, and maybe we'll be able to accelerate and build this technology which could then benefit the world together. Talking
And
about
India
AGI,
could play a role in helping that happen. You're the biggest country on the planet.
right?
And those in Silicon Valley, the United States, I make a joke. I say, if we have an architect's meeting is like your first meeting of software. And I say, if there's no Indian accent in the room, it's not a serious meeting. And that's how much respect there is. And everybody and you're laughing, they laugh. That tells you how important India's voice, whether it's in Silicon Valley or in Delhi, India, or preferably also in the UN, India's voice matters.
True.
So I'd like to see the Indian ambassador to the UN say something.
Yeah, I really hope and I wish that somebody takes the right stance. AGI, artificial.
Are your listeners listening? Change is usually simple. Somebody's got to move.
Right, completely. Yeah, I double that. It's that one person, taking that step, and I think it just acts as like a butterfly effect.
Yeah. Who was the guy? Gandhi? I think he was from India.
Exactly. Yeah. So talking about artificial general intelligence, we spoke about the transformation this technology could bring, and also its existential risk. Could you kind of maybe detail that out? What would be those existential risks, and what would be those life-changing transformation which AGI could bring?
Right. Okay. Here's an example. As I'm sure your listeners know, artificial intelligence, current stuff and future stuff requires a lot of energy. And India getting wealthy, the amount of electricity requirements coming up are gigantic. And at the same time, we're trying to make a transition from fossil fuels and energy to non-fossil fuels and renewable energy. So how can we do all that? Right now, your energy is 80% of the world, 80% is fossil fuel based. So how can we get rid of that 80%, create a replacement for that 80%, plus grow a great deal more coming up very soon, not to mention air conditioning systems and so forth. So that problem all by itself might also be impossible. But in the process, AGI would be in all the electric switching systems of the planet. And if it's a showdown between human getting electricity or AGI getting electricity at some point in the future, who do you think's going to win? Now, if people have had problems in the world with blackouts and brownouts, but they knew that next week or next day or next hour, the light bulb will be back on. So even though it was uncomfortable and a pain in the neck and horrible and causing deaths in hospitals and so forth, we knew that, but it'll be back on. We don't know that with AGI because you look at those demand curves and look at those supply capabilities, and then look at the climate change requirements. AI could pretty well get in the way of humans using electricity. And if you start knocking out electricity usage for billions of people, that's an awful lot of social chaos. And in social chaos, health systems break down, disease systems break down, law and order breaks down, etc. So you can see a world slowly ripping itself apart. That's probably the most plausible way of finishing us off. There's also the science fiction side. I shouldn't call it science fiction because that sounds prejudicial a bit. But the idea that a more intelligent species will treat a less intelligent species well is not very well shown in history. And when we build a road somewhere and we kill some worms, we don't mean to kill the world. We're not anti-worm. We didn't pay attention to it. We just built that road. So a lot of AGI might very well not take us into account in the same way that we don't take the worms into account when we build a road.
Right. It might just be collateral damage. But I hope that we build AGI which has human benefit at its...
That requires regulation. It will not happen automatically. Let me backtrack what I just said. There is an exception to this. NVIDIA and probably some others are working on how you make a chip more efficient so you use less electricity. But aside from that, which is also an important thing, the idea is how do you put the values that people agreed to in the chip so that it doesn't run the software, as I mentioned before. So even if we don't get international regulation, the chip manufacturing may be plan B, so to speak. We would want to do it as both plan A as well. But I mean, that might be a reason to be hopeful, even if we can't work out the agreements with politicians.
Can you give us a brief about the Millennium Project? When did you start it? What was its mission and how has it evolved over the years in response to the rise of artificial intelligence?
Right. Well, it started with an article by Ted Gordon, Theodore J. Gordon, who was at the Rand Corporation, the first think tank, who helped move futurist thinking from just a bunch of geniuses sitting around a table to actually some analytic method stuff like the Delphi forecasting, cross-impact analysis, technology sequence, and a bunch of other methods. And we knew each other for some time. And I was the United Nations University liaison between Tokyo and the United States and Tokyo. UN University, by the way, is the only part of the UN headquartered in all of Asia. And so Ted was saying there ought to be this major study. This is back in 1988. And so we're looking at the year 2000 and saying that, people are going to say, think about the future, the year 2000 and all that sort of stuff. So we futurists have a responsibility to get together and create some mega study that the world would be ready for the year 2000. And he said, and the UN University's got to do it because his think tank was a for-profit think tank, the Futures Group. And you'd have to be some sort of a UN thing. And since I was UN University and I could spell the word future, he says, you got to make it happen. And I said, no, I don't want to do another mega study, just another mega. What I want is a system that can make mega studies like this. So we need a global system, a global decentralized think tank system that can study stuff, not just because sometimes you'll have people say, we have an international think tank in Harvard. We have a person from India, a person from China, a person from France, and they all got their PhDs at Stanford, right? So that what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a system, which we did, of what we call nodes. This is a group of individual and institutions in each major country that connects local thinking with the global thinking back and forth. So like that report that you just referred to was sent out to all our node chairs around the world. They can go into different languages and give it to their ministries of foreign affairs. So it's a way to have input-output of a think tank on an ongoing, continuous basis. We started under the UN University in our feasibility study, but as those who work in a university know, university politics can be, hi, how are you, and knife you in the back. And then, of course, you take the bureaucracy problems of management in the UN, and you put the university and the UN together, it can be really difficult. So eventually, we eventually went independent. We were underneath the American Council for UN University for a while. We're under the World Federation of UN Associations for a while, but eventually we went independent. But it was very important to start under the UN because it was a statement of values. It didn't start in one country. It was started, we had early support from Moscow and Iran and completely different countries that don't normally cooperate too well. So it has now evolved to a point that there's 70 of these nodes around the world and they can initiate their own activity and they can use all the rest of the Millennium Project. So it's like it's a leader full system. So it's not like I'm the only guy that says what's going to happen. But going back to part of your question about what we do is as we do this global assessment of 15 global challenges and other sort of issues, we try to find the gaps, what's not being done that ought to be done. And then we try to address that. So one of the things and then we poll our chairs around the world on what ought to be our priorities. Several years ago, the one that was rated the most important was to establish what was called anticipatory democracy, anticipatory decision making, anticipatory governance, so that you're creating a rule before the thing that you are regulating occurs, because the technology is happening so fast, you don't have the normal time to do this. So when people say, well, keep up with AI, I said, no, you can't keep up with it. But what you can do is you can anticipate AI, you can get ahead and then intervene ahead of time. That you can do. So the idea was, okay, we're going to do anticipatory decision-making and regulation, and what should be the priority of that? And then the answer was AGI, because it's not being done by anybody. This is several years ago. So that's how we got to the point of AGI. It's a cumulative, we've been in business for over 30 years. So we're trying to do a cumulative research like our brain. So instead of saying, here's a study on water, and then the next study is on energy, but we didn't have any relationship between the two. So each should be an accumulation of going forward. So then you find out the most strategic blind spots. And AGI right now, we think is the most important blind spot. And when that gets in motion enough, then we'll probably work on synthetic biology, because synthetic biology doesn't have any rules either. And that's also pretty important.
Right. Yeah, I think we are sitting at such a fantastic point of time, and all of these technologies, it's not just today, it's not just artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence. There's synthetic biology, there's nanotechnology, there's AR, VR, MR, which I think is growing rapidly. There's robotic, autonomous vehicle, and there's a convergence of sorts. And I guess once these things converges, I think, there's going to be more value, more utility, and I think the world is going to get completely changed. As a futurist, I wanted some answers from your side, because I think the world is really changing very, very fast, and there is a bunch of people who are very, very scared because of artificial intelligence, because there's this narrative that the future of work is going to be very, very different. It's going to be more AI. There's going to be more automation. The future of education, healthcare is going to be completely different. Even the role of money might completely change, from fiat currency, it might go to cryptocurrency, because meaning might go away, because in the next decade or so, with AI agents becoming more capable, because even today there are these AI agents which does coding and so on and so forth. Would love to hear from you, your perspective on what the next 5 to 10 years holds for the rest of the world in terms of work, education, and healthcare.
We actually did a report on that. It's called Work Tech 2050, scenarios and actions, or actions and scenarios. Anyway, it's on our website. If you go to our website, you'll see it there. And one of the things that we did was we read a whole bunch of, by the way, how do you do futures? You read a lot of reading. Anyway, to make a long story short, scenario one, we call it a mixed bag, where there's like intelligence and stupidity. Some countries anticipate this stuff and do okay, and some countries don't. And then there's a little bit of migration problems in this. And then scenario number two assumes that countries don't take it seriously. And this is a nightmare. If you have friends that are too optimistic and positive, have them read scenario two. This will sober them up. And then if somebody's too negative, have them read number three. This is the positive one. But when you make a positive scenario, you don't just say, here's how everything works. You have to show how the negative scenario is defeated. Otherwise, you're wasting people's time. And so we have scenario number three. We call it, if humans were free, the self-actualization economy. I figured in the United States, we couldn't make the UBI work, universal basic income work, in these P5. So what happens if people were actually guaranteed that they won't starve, and that they could then have their AI avatar go running around the world while they're sound asleep, and the next morning wakes up and says, by the way, I just found 75,000 things you'd like to do tomorrow morning or the morning. And of course you figure you can't do 75,000. So you say, all right, run your program to figure out what I would really like. 10 things I would like to do just because I like to do them, and 10 things you got smart contracts ready to go that would earn some income. So let's say, for example, in the future, I get this email from a guy in India that says, will you come on the podcast? So then I put out a little note to my avatar and say, who in the world would like to oversee or listen to the podcast? And it's going to cost you €1. So maybe 300 people say yes in the world. Well, that takes care of a very fancy lunch. So the idea is that you can make a living out of you being you rather than being somebody else, because your competitive advantage is you, right? I can't be as good at you as you. No matter how hard I try, I'm not going to do it. But if you're making the same thing that I'm making, then I want to elbow you out. But if I'm so busy being me, what do I want to give you a hard time for? I'm enjoying myself. So it could be quite a beautiful future of the self-actualization economy. However, even by 2050, we figured that you'd only be able to get your work, even though there's more than 6 billion people at that point, there'd be about 6 billion people sort of like in the range of work time. And in there, we figure we maybe could get 3 billion people to make this transition by then. But another billion, no, they're still in that transition, working it out. It's not doing so well and so forth. And then others are still in the informal economy, because as you know, the majority of the world is in the informal economy right now. Making that change, even in 35 years, is not that easy. So we still figure that, even though we think it's no longer the majority, but you still have a lot of people still in the informal economy. But even those in the informal economy can still get access to their AI avatar in a local library or a community hub. They don't have to have any other commuter. They can be very poor and they can still get some advantage. And this goes back to, if we don't believe it's possible, no one will try. If it's possible to make the world work for everybody with the help of AGI in a good way and with the regulation, then why not try? So scenario 3 says, here's what you can push for. Scenario 2 says, this is what you got to prevent. And 1 says, if you just do what you're doing like right now, it'll be okay for some people, but not for everybody, like today.
Last question to you. Paint a picture of what, since you're a futurist, wear that futurist hat of yours and, paint a picture of what the world is going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years.
Oh, 5 to 10, that's not too far off. Well, because things in motion are, I think you invented this idea of earthly ignorance, momentum, or whatever, that Tomas, whatever it's called. That's still the majority. So 5 years from now will still be a lot of like now. Although the tools, like in the AI, AGI could very well be in place. If we don't have it in place, then the social anxiety will be much higher than it is right now. If, on the other hand, you've got China and the United States collaborating on all this sort of stuff, then the world's going to be a bit positive, because if the two potential, even the USSR, they managed the nuclear stuff, but they didn't manage other stuff. Whereas this cuts across a whole lot. So if China and the United States do collaborate, then we've got a pretty good deal. And that could be in 5 years. Should be sooner than 5 years. And then another 5 year, like 10 after that, you're starting to get into people being taught in schools. Who are you? Because right now, schools teach you how to fit in. And then the job teaches you how to fit in. Well, Finland is one of the people that's actually working on self-actualization of children. And there's math scores, by the way, almost the same as South Korea. 2 different education systems. 1, freedom, no homework, project-oriented, follow your curiosity, in the South Korea, no. You have a tutor, you're going to cram this thing. Every day you're going to be in school. Every Sunday, every Monday, you're going to push, and you're going to push, and you're going to push. Same math scores. Check it out. Do a Google search on international, whatever the score, and you'll see right up at the top is Finland, right up at the top is South Korea, and then the top 5 is over. So I think in 10 years from now, we should have begun seriously the transition of having people able to get educated with an education system that helps them learn what they want to learn and at the rate they want to learn, because people learn different things at different rates, and having everybody lockstep in, not smart. Again, going back to, if we can get these cooperations together, I think 10 years from now, we've got a much happier future and a less conflicting future, because as I say, if you're doing self-actualization, you're not interested in giving the other guy a hard time. That's slowing you down. So we could have a much more collaborative society. And the idea of synergy is slowly taking place around the world. And in 10 years, it might even be getting into the mainstream, so that we look at synergetic intelligence as well as competitive intelligence.
Jerome, it was a true pleasure, spending time talking to you and learning from you. I truly wish we go into a world which is more collaborative rather than towards conflict. Because we are at the cusp of creating one of the most fantastic technological transformational tool that we have ever seen. And what I find extremely interesting about what you've been doing over the last 50 years with your Millennium Project is this participatory think tank, where you are having the voices from the entire world, be relevant in creating something which is better for everyone. And I wish on that note that, this fantastic point of time, we create a fantastic world that maybe possibly 10 years later, maybe we can revisit this episode and maybe analyze, what are the things we did right. And I hope we get over there rather than we go towards maybe, analyzing and saying what are the things that we did wrong. And I really hope that we don't go towards that direction. And more power to, everything that you do. And to my listeners, if you like what you see and hear, then please press the subscribe button. And until next time, see you guys. I really, really appreciate this. Yeah. Thank you.
Namaste.